Hello, if this is your first time watching one of my videos, hello again if you're back for more fun or punishment, however you look at it. Today we're going to be talking about positive and negative numbers. And it's something that's a bit challenging sometimes for people, but it's something we have to deal with. I've got here on the board an example. If you had $20 in your checking account and you wrote a check for $30, what's your bank going to tell you? Okay, they're not going to come out and say, well, you're down below zero, but we don't go into the negative, so we'll just leave it at that. They're going to show you in your account that you're in the negative, which means you owe them money. And that's just an example. Negative numbers are real. We have to learn how to deal with them, whether we like it or not. I'd be perfectly content if there had been some way that this whole thing could have been designed so we just started at zero and went up. Never went to the negative. But I've lived a long time and I know that's not realistic. We run into negative numbers all the time. What I was doing here was just kind of showing a visual representation of numbers. And this is what is chosen to do that. You might be surprised, and then again you might say, well, that makes sense. They use a number line to represent it. So they draw a line. They have a place here where they start the measurements, and going to the right, they mark off certain whatever units that they happen to want to use. And they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I want to know where 5 is on the number line, I just start at the 0. And by the way, that's called the origin. The origin. You know why they picked that number? Or that name, I mean? I'm not really sure. But I have heard of a book called The Origin of the Species. And it talks about theories of how life began, where it began, when it began, that kind of thing. So when we do our measuring, that spot right there called the origin is where we start our measurements. Okay, now if I wanted to go 3 2/3, now just listen for a second when I say that. 3 2/3, I think you'll see that what we would do is we'd go over here 3, and then we would go 2/3 of one more. So even though on the number line most of the time they just show numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, in between all of those whole numbers that we have there are all kinds of fractions. That should scare you really well. You want to stay away from the number line. You think of all those fractions that are there. So, to the right, we have positive numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, what about to the left? Well, each of these units are going to be the same, but we're going in the opposite direction. And they came up with a little symbol to represent that. Got the same distance, but now to show we're going in the opposite direction, we use that little slash thing. And it's called different things. It's called negative, it's called minus, whatever you particularly want to do, then that's how you do it. Now, it's interesting, just some interesting things here. Well, okay, you may not think they're interesting, but there's things we need to understand. Look what's happening as we go to the right. What's happening to those numbers as we go to the right? Okay, they're getting bigger. In other words, 5 is bigger than 4. Now, if I have to write out is bigger than every time, that would take a lot of space. And mathematicians are very efficient, so they came up with a little symbol to represent that. So when they want to say that 5 is bigger than 4, they write it like this. They write the 5 And they write this thing that kind of looks like a V laying on its side, and then they put the 4. Now the question arises, which way do you do that? Which number goes where? Well, some people like to look at this, and this is the idea they came up with. They call this an alligator mouth, because, you know, it kind of looks like an alligator, and the alligator's about to eat the big number. And if that works for you, that's great. Me, I never knew an alligator wouldn't eat anything that was put in front of him, so that never quite worked for me. So what I had to do is just say, okay, this is a big opening here on this side, and over here on this side is a little tiny one you can hardly see. And I put the big number by the big opening, the little number by the little opening. But it doesn't matter. It's just some way to reflect how these numbers are related to each other. Now, I don't think anybody has much problem when you're going to the right and you look at these numbers and you know, you pretty well know which one's bigger. The problem comes over here on the other side, because when I go here, I've gone 2 in the negative direction, 3 in the negative direction, and the numbers themselves are getting bigger and bigger. And because that's what our brain sees and that's what it registers, sometimes we have trouble. And so when I ask this question, which of those two numbers is bigger, the -7 or -5, some people have a little problem with that because they look at that 7 and they know that 7 is definitely bigger than the 5 is. And so they have a hard time getting that straight. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm going to ask you to answer a question here. Would you rather have a -$5 or a -$7? You think about that? -5 or -7. Now, if you like -7, let's get together. I can make you a really good deal. Because in reality, and if you think of that example we used at the start when we were talking about the checking account, if you have -$7 in your account, you have less money than if you have -5. So if I had this situation here, I would have to put that the -5 is bigger than the -7. Somehow, you've got to find a way to get your brain to accept that. And these are some of the problems we have with our brains. The brain looks at that 7 and 5, and the brain automatically thinks the 7's bigger. And so you've got to find some way to get your brain to look at that in the right way. And using that idea of, would you rather have -7 or -$5, sometimes that works. And so figure out what works for you so that you can tell when you're talking about negatives what the relationship is. Now, another thing, let me just quick erase this, that we need to talk about when we're talking about numbers, and that relates to distance. Is it possible to walk a -10 feet? Okay, I mean, you can walk backwards 10 feet, but you can't walk a -feet. Now, you know, we see all these things in these science fiction movies where black holes or whatever, maybe, you know, something like that, there's negative distance, but for us in the real world, there really isn't negative distance. So when we're dealing with numbers, we've got to have some way of dealing with the fact that distance is always going to be positive. In other words, if I'm looking at my number line, and I've got on one side of my 0 over here, I've got +5, over here I've got -5, and I ask, is it farther to the +5 or the -5? Well, if I got something out and measured it, it's the same distance. The distance is the same whether which direction I'm going. And so that created a bit of a problem, and some mathematicians, and they're really good to do this because they like efficiency, they said, okay, we're going to have to come up with a symbol to make sure that distance is always positive. What they came up with was those two little lines kind of close together there. And whenever we see that symbol, it's called, by the way, absolute value. Now, if you think about that for a second, you might be able to get your brain to think absolute value. That means we just want to know the value of the number without relationship to any sign at all. Just the value of the number. And so that's what they came up with. This symbol is called absolute value, and it's defined to be the distance from 0, our origin here, to any number on the number line. So if I put a number in like that, the absolute value of -5 is 5. And that's because it's 5 units from 0 to -5. It's a little hard on our brain sometimes because we could put right next to that, we could put this problem. And as much as we talk about signs, we'd look at this and say, wait a minute, that's 5 too? How can you have a 5 and a -5 have the same value? I mean, how could they be represented by the same number? Well, that's the challenge. And what you've got to do is you've got to get your brain to say, it's just the distance. This symbol here just relates to distance. And the distance is the same from 0 to 5 as it is from 0 to -5. That's true. That's what it is. And we've just got to get our brains to see it. So you've got to learn to look at symbols and think about what the symbols mean, and then forget about all of the other things that sometimes get in the way when we talk about numbers. The absolute value is the distance to that number from 0 on the number line. Now, this is a grouping symbol because I have to do it first. When I talk about the absolute value of a number, it has to be distance. So I've got to find out what that distance is. So when I have the absolute value of, or let's say I have the absolute value of -5, then I have to think about what that is. But if somebody asks me, puts a negative outside of that, then that says I want to know the opposite of that absolute value. Well, think about it for a second. If I don't find that value first, and I take the absolute value, how do I know I'm taking the absolute value of what I need? So this reads, I want the opposite of the absolute value of -5. And if you think about that, you can tell that you're going to have to find the absolute value of -5 first. Okay, the absolute value of -5 is the distance from 0 to -5. Now, it may be going a different direction than what we want to go, but it still is 5 units from 0 to -5. If I want to know the opposite of that, then that's going to be equal to -5. Now, did your brain just look at that and just shudder a little bit? Because how many times have you been told that 2 negatives make a positive? And here we're saying 2 negatives and we get a negative. These are some of the conflicts we run into sometimes when we're dealing with numbers, and that's why it's absolutely essential that you remember that this symbol has to do with distance. And so you got to find that first before you do anything to it, whether you're talking about absolute value or whatever. Now, that idea of opposite, if you get used to that, it can be helpful in dealing with numbers. If I talk about the opposite of 11, what's that going to be? Basically, if you remember it this way, it might help. where mostly what we're talking about is going in the opposite direction. Now when we talk about opposite direction, we kind of can get a feel for what that is. The direction from 0 to 11 is out this way on the number line. So when I say the opposite of that, then I'm going to be going in this direction, and these numbers on the left are negatives. So the opposite of 11 would be negative 11. What would the opposite of negative 13 be? I'll just write OPP for that, of negative 13. Well, if you think about the direction you're going, 13 is going in this direction, the negatives. The opposite of that refers to the direction. So I'm going to be going in this direction. Those are positive. So the opposite of negative 13 is positive 13. Now these are just things that are kind of a little difficult sometimes for our brain to wrap around, but that's the reality of it. So you've got to make sure you're clear on these concepts so that you can work it. And we're going to be using these in some of the things that are coming up. So you've got to be clear on it. And this, if you think about that, this going back to this then makes sense. The opposite of this absolute value, since absolute value is distance and is always going to be positive, the opposite of an absolute value is going to be negative. So take some time, review the notes, watch the video and review the notes together, and think about it, talk your way through it. The more of your senses that you get involved in the learning experience, the better you're going to remember it. The easier it's going to be to learn, the better you're going to remember it. So take the time to do that. It's really important that you get comfortable with negative numbers, especially in light of what we're going to be doing next. And we'll see you then. Hope this helped.